So let's talk about sort of the different ways that we can use the ideas of critical criminology. So we're thinking outside of your basic conflict box. And so, of course, there's a kitty in a box. So the some of the different things I'm going to talk about is left realism, critical feminist theory, and peacemaking theory. So left realism is basically, it starts with the assumption that, well, relative deprivation leads to discontent. That means that if people feel like they have less than other people, or if they legitimately do, objectively, they do have less than other people, then that makes you unhappy. And that makes sense. And then when there's no political solution to that, meaning that your government is not stepping in to help you when you know you have less than other people, and maybe most other people, that leads to crime. So crime then is a function of economic inequality, but also community deprivation, and then generally a lack of supportive institutions. So it comes from the idea of, well, there's no political solution, there's no solution from my government, but I'm also not getting support from local institutions, things like schools and churches and the police. I feel like they're not helping me. So crime then happens much more often when you have populations that feel like they have less, or they legitimately do have less. They feel like there's not as much community relationships, and they don't have support from local institutions. So the goal then of left realism is to achieve a fair and orderly society through a practical emphasis on social justice. And so here's where it is. It's the focus is on a pragmatic assessment of crime and the needs of crime victims, and then pragmatic solutions. So that's why it's called left realism, because it's about realistic ways to address the relative deprivation that exists in society. So then to control crime, some of the most pragmatic solutions are things like community-based efforts. And so because some of these hold the most promise for crime control. And these are things like neighborhood watch, and like patrols by members of the community, things like people keeping an eye out on their fellow neighbor, or on kind of having the feeling that the neighborhood park is our property, so we're going to look after it, we're going to take care of it, we're going to keep it clean, we're going to we're going to keep it well lit, and things like that. So these community-based efforts hold some of the greatest promise. Now, critics are going to say that left realists are actually legitimizing the existing power structure, in the sense that, well, there's no point in addressing the existing power structure. But a socialist state lacking a police force is just unrealistic. We can't, it's not going to work, especially in a society like in America. And so the criminal code does, or at least it's supposed to, represent public opinion. And so we shouldn't disregard that. So in general, we agree we shouldn't be able to murder people and hurt people and steal from people and rape people. Like, we agree with that stuff, at least the bare bones of it. So we can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. So while left realism could be seen as legitimizing the existing power structure, instead it's actually more of just, well, in a realistic way, how can we address these issues? So short of overthrowing the government and overthrowing capitalism and making America entirely socialist with no police force, short of doing that, what are some pragmatic on-the-ground things we can do to address these shortfalls and to address the people that are not getting what they need? And so that's the realistic approach to left realism. And so then critical feminism, basically it takes the ideas of critical theory and Marxism and applies it specifically from a feminist lens. So there's these unequal powers of the genders, in particular, in capitalist society, which then breeds inequality and exploitation. So patriarchy is supported by capitalism. So patriarchy being male dominance, male supremacy, it's supported by capitalists. It sustains female oppression at home and in the workplace. And so we look, and crime patterns are certainly linked to gender conflict. Women don't have the power to commit certain crimes, and so they just don't. Women are very far less likely to be in the positions of power to be a part of things like state-sponsored crime and things like that. And that powerlessness, though, at the ground level increases their own victimization. And so it's that powerlessness, that the patriarchy that is supported by the capitalist system, which also supports the capitalist system also supports patriarchy. So you have this system that that thrives on the powerlessness of females and women. So then that also leads to exploitation, and female victims often get into trouble trying to escape victimization. So things like runaways and drug users, property offenders. Also, young girls who get into trouble with the criminal justice system are considered worse than young boys because it's more rare and it's not ladylike. So a young girl who commits the same crime as a young boy sometimes then is treated worse by the criminal justice system, because it's so rare that a young lady would do this. And so it's sort of this extra control measure that we need to enforce. So then that exploitation will affect kind of what female delinquency itself looks like. So a particular theory that comes from this is the power control theory by Hagen. And this is basically sees crime as a function of class position, being power, and family functions, being control. So parents reproduce the power they hold at work at home. So Hagen talked about there's these two main type of families. He said that there were these paternalistic families and egalitarian families. So paternalistic families are like your quote-unquote traditional family, with the father as the breadwinner, the mother is expected to control the children and raise the children, and that part of that expectation is that she's expected to control daughters more while letting sons have more freedom. So girls then, under this kind of a family, if they're raised in this kind of a family, they're going to internalize that inequality, and that'll be through things like drug use and running away, while boys will externalize. So they will commit acts of violence, mischief, property crime, things like that. Whereas in egalitarian families, both of the parents share the positions of power. And so then that trickles down to how the children are treated, where the girls are treated and thus behave more or less the way that boys are in terms of deviance. So you won't see that gendered variation in the types of delinquency. You won't see more crime, it's just going to look different. And so this is also, Hagen also equated this to single mother households. So if you have single parent households that are run by a female head of a household, then it's going to basically look the same as an egalitarian family. Support for this theory is kind of inconclusive, though, and it is waning, especially because it can't really account for the many different types of families that exist today. So it's kind of becoming less and less useful. But that's still the overall idea, is that the power that exists in the workplace is then reproduced in the home. And I mean, it does still hold some merit on kind of a case-by-case basis. And then peacemaking criminology, well, the purpose, just like what it sounds, is it's about promoting peace. It's promoting a peaceful, just society. So everybody gets the same treatment, and everybody in general feels this idea of things are relatively peaceful. And so the inspiration for this is certainly from religious and philosophical teachings, but the idea is that it's about punishing and controlling crime. The peacemaking criminologists see that as a way to encourage, not discourage crime. So if you're just about punishment and control, and we need to stop people and make them do what we want them to do, that's only going to encourage people to commit more crime. It's not going to help the situation. So peacemaking criminology advocates this idea of mediation, conflict resolution, rather than prison. Prison should be seen as a last resort, not the first thing that you jump to. So from a peacemaking criminologist perspective, if possible, you should be doing things like mediation and conflict resolution, and prison should only happen if those things don't work. So part of peacemaking criminology is restorative justice, which you may be familiar with this term because it's thrown around a lot. Because it's becoming this sort of big up and coming over the past couple of decades, it's gotten a whole lot of support and kind of a surge because it works. So the tenets of restorative justice is, in general, you're addressing the victim harms and the victim needs. So there's a lot of, we can look at policies and things like that are meant to reduce recidivism and whatnot in the typical criminal justice system that's more retributive. And everything's focused on the offender. So restorative justice takes that focus away, so it's not all on the offender. There is still, of course, focus on the offender, but it also brings the victim into it, and it addresses what does the victim need, what harms were done to the victim, and how can we address those harms. It also very much holds the offenders accountable. So this is not about letting offenders get away with things, because if you don't hold them accountable, they're just going to do it again. So you still have to have that accountability in order to have a useful justice system. But the idea is that it involves both the victims, the offenders, and the larger community. So it involves everybody that was potentially affected by a certain type of crime. And so the core then of restorative justice is basically respect for everybody, including the offender, but also the idea that you are respecting the victims and the communities and recognizing that they were affected by this crime and they should be part of the process. So one major type of restorative justice approach is what's called reintegrative shaming. So shame in general is a powerful, powerful tool of informal social control. But if it's used the wrong way, then it basically leads to stigmatization. So it's this process of degradation. The offender is branded an evil person. You cast them out of society. You use that shame and you apply it to the person. Reintegrative shaming is using that powerful, powerful tool of shame, but in a reintegrative way. So that disapproval is about the offender's behavior and their poor choices, not the person themselves. So the person is still respected, and it's that you're working towards societal reacceptance. You want to bring that person back to society, but they can't make those same decisions they were making. They have to change their ways, and they can't behave that way if they want to be part of society. So the idea of reintegrative shaming is shaming the behavior, not the person. And to be reintegrative, shaming has to be brief, it has to be controlled, and then it has to be followed by some kind of ceremony of forgiveness, apology, repentance, reacceptance. So it needs to be clear that the shame is attached to the behavior, not the person. And then you're using that powerful tool in a way that's actually going to help the person come back to society, and that's the point. So when we're looking at restoration then from a RJ perspective, really we're redefining crime, where the conflict is between the offender, the victim, and anybody else who was affected. So families, schools, communities, so everybody is part of the restoration part of it. So to be effective, first of all, from any kind of restorative justice policy, the offender has to admit to the harm caused. This won't work if they're claiming innocence and they're saying I didn't hurt anybody, or they have to admit that what they've done. So that's a big first step that can't always be achieved, but that's kind of the way that it has to start. And it has to be a healing process, not a retributive process. This is not about getting vengeance. It's about fixing the wrongs that were done. And the offender has to have a stake in the community. The offender has to have ties that he cares about to the community or to some kind of social group. Otherwise, it's unlikely that the offender is going to accept responsibility, unlikely that the offender will show remorse, and unlikely that they're going to work to repair the injuries that caused the crime in the first place. So there has to be that stake, that bond to society. And the offender has to commit to restitution and reparation. They have to commit, whether it's monetary or labor restitution, but also the reparation, which is an apology. And that's a big part of RJ, is the offender has a chance to apologize. So some restoration-focused programs, sentencing circles, very common within Native communities. It includes community members, victims, elders, the criminal justice system agents. Each member gets to have their say about the damage done, how it can be repaired. The offender has a chance to express remorse, work towards fixing the problems that were caused by the crime, and then they get forgiveness and sort of reacceptance. School diversion programs are also great. This is used to deal with students that are committing minor crimes, things like drug and alcohol use. And it's about working to improve the relationships to key community figures and providing that mentorship. Community policing is another good example where policies are affected by the input from the community, and it's about working proactively, not reactively, to address problems within the community that can cause crime. And then diversions in the courts as well. So this is where we're encouraging victim offender mediation, conflict resolution in lieu of formal sentencing, like the victim offender reconciliation programs that we've talked about previously. And circles of support and accountability are an interesting one. These are specifically programs for released sex offenders. And I was involved in this when I was in Canada. And so it's about this, where you have a circle of support for a released sex offender, because otherwise you just release them in the community and they don't know how to function. So it's about holding them accountable for what they've done and what they're doing. So making sure they're not doing things like looking at online pornography or things like that, but also that they're supported and that they can find a place to live and work and things like that. It's very effective, like many RJ programs are.